So that when you are college educated and some institution has declared you graduated and a learned member of society, if you turn around and say, I choose not to believe this emergent scientific consensus, no, you don't have that option.
No,
Wow.
you don't have that option.
Yeah.
Wow.
Unbelievable. So, Dr. Malone, do we have an option?
Well, I sure hope so, because this is supposed to be science, not scientism.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. Fred, it is great to be back with you talking about real science on Friday.
Today we are going to look behind the curtain at some of the politics involved with science and its impact on shows like ours. There's a new book out called PsyWar, Enforcing the New World Order. It's written by well-known scientist and medical doctor, Dr. Robert Malone, and co-authored by his wife, Dr. Jill Malone. What particularly caught my eye was the part of the intro that reads, quote, "Free speech is the most pragmatic tool we have to ascertaining truth. Only by examining all sides of an issue can the truth be chiseled out like a statue of marble. We must defend all speech, whether untrue, hateful, or intolerable, as this is the only way to protect our right to understand the world." So one of our mantras at Real Science Radio is defending the biblical claim that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen by the things that are made. But getting the truth out can be very challenging. And Doug, this book offers advice and a way forward in navigating this psychological warfare that permeates all around us.
Yeah, indeed. Fred, Dr. Malone is an authority I first quoted on my Weekly Worldview podcast in the summer of 2021 when I read about an interview that Dr. Malone gave, and on my broadcast I labeled that testimony against interest. I said, here is Dr. Robert Malone giving testimony against interest because he questioned the wisdom of Operation Warp Speed and the safety of a technology that appeared to be a major part of his life's work, the mRNA technology that was being deployed in the COVID shots. And by the way, Dr. Malone published a book titled Novel Coronavirus in February, Fred, February of 2020. Turn your mind back in the Wayback Machine. February of 2020 was before the lockdowns. It was before the mandates. It was before the masks. It was before they even called it COVID. He wrote a book, Novel Coronavirus, called it a pragmatic, practical guide full of everyday tips for living in the real world and doing what you could to avoid getting infected with the novel coronavirus. And then in 2022, Dr. Malone published Lies My Government Told Me, exposing, among other things, how during the COVID panic, the governments intentionally weaponized fear to mold behavior, and the media smeared anyone who objected to the narrative. And yes, Fred, Robert Malone's latest title, PsyWar, Enforcing the New World Order, examines governmental coordination and deployment of propaganda, censorship, psychological operations, all to manipulate public opinion. And we'll link to all Dr. Malone's books in the description and in the show summary, Fred.
Well, over the last couple of years, I've been able to catch some of his interviews. He's appeared before the Health Committee of the Texas Senate, and he's been all over the news world, Doug, including Tucker Carlson, Newsmax. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast. You've heard of that guy. And now Dr. Robert Malone can add Real Science Radio to his list of shows he's been on. I'd like to welcome to the airwaves Dr. Robert Malone. It's so great. It's such an honor to have you joining us, Dr. Malone.
Thank you, and I hope everybody listening had a great Thanksgiving. It certainly was lovely here. We have a lot to celebrate, and we're going to talk about some dark things here, but I think it's important to remember the words of General Michael Flynn. It's bad now, it's going to get worse, and we win in the end.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, great way to put it. I've been saying that for a long time. It's like it's the unstoppable Hail Mary. They're going to get us down to the 1 yard line. They're going to think they have us beat, and we're going to come in. God's going to come in, and it's going to be the unstoppable Hail Mary. We win in the end, just like you said. And General Flynn wrote the foreword to your latest book, I believe. So, Dr. Malone, before we get started in diving into your book, because it's so pertinent to what we face here at Real Science Radio, can you give a little bit of our audience your background? I know that you were you pioneered the mRNA and DNA vaccines.
Yeah, okay, so that's, if you look on my Wikipedia page, it's been yet again had major edits. It's kind of like calculus. You know how you gradually approximate the truth in calculus? Well, it's kind of like that, and it keeps getting a little tiny bit better incrementally, month by month. But they still have in there these various things to cast shade on my contributions to the tech. So in short, when I was, late 20s, as a graduate student at the Salk Institute in a gene therapy lab, one of the top gene therapy labs in the world at the time, that of Dr. Indra Verma, who later became the director of the Salk Institute and chief editor for Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Indra ran a 20-person all postdoc. I was the only graduate student gene therapy lab. And I was investigating, as a graduate student, nuances of how retroviruses package themselves. Retroviruses exist outside of the cell as RNA, and then they become DNA once they're in the cell. And so I was asking questions about how retrovirus RNA gets packaged, and I had to develop a suite of technologies to ask the questions using reverse genetics. And that included manufacturing and purifying synthetic RNA at large scale, still the same set of enzymes, basically the same protocol that's used currently, only I did manage to get the DNA out of my samples, unlike the current products, and many other things having to do with how to deliver these. And I wrote in, I think it's 1987, the first disclosure. So there's a patent disclosure countersigned by another postdoc in the lab for the use of RNA as a drug, as a pharmaceutical. And that was a radical idea at the time. All gene therapy was based on recombinant viruses like adenovirus or retrovirus or adeno-associated virus. And the idea of non-viral gene therapy, let alone RNA as a drug, was really way, 2 standard deviations beyond the mean. That was way out. So that set off a cascade where, because I was at the Salk, but also had my primary position at UC San Diego, which is right across the street, there became a kind of a patent battle between the lawyers at UC and the lawyers at the Salk, each one telling me I shouldn't talk to the other, and a whole bunch of ugly kind of inside baseball politics, science politics, big science politics over who was going to get credit, who was going to be on the patents, blah, 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 blah. Remember, this is late 1980s. In long story short, and I've recorded multiple podcasts about this, there's no reason to go over it again, I ended up with a nervous breakdown and a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. I was a wet behind the ears, ambitious graduate student encountering the rather unpleasant world of big science and big money and biotech. In La Jolla, La Jolla at the time was really kicking off as a major biotech hub. So a lot of that going around. I left the Salk with a master's instead of my PhD. So a master's in lieu of a PhD based on the work that I'd done, which, eventually led to a Nobel Prize. So not bad for a master's degree. And joined a little tiny startup across the street. I was employee number 10. They let me set up a skunk works. The company was called Vical. It was focused on antivirals. This is AIDS-related research with liposomes and calcitonin analogs, hence the name. And they allowed me to bring over my reagents, my protocols, et cetera, and gave me a stipend as a technician of about, I think it was $18,000 or $19,000 a year, and a operating budget of about $25,000. And with that, I reduced to practice the use of, I'd already demonstrated that the RNA could be put into a variety of different kinds of cell lines and frogs and chick embryos, so I'd already reduced it to practice for delivery into whole animals. But then we carried it forward. I developed RNAs expressing antisense for AIDS and AIDS antigens, and others in the lab developed RNAs expressing influenza antigens. And then together with others, this was reduced to practice in mice, showing that you could mount an immune response in mice. And a series of patents, and you see the widescreen here, but these are some of them that issued in the United States over the next decade on that work that were all filed from Vical mostly, and then some others when I was an academic subsequently. So that's kind of the backstory to this, and this all happened about a decade before Carrico and Weissman, who got the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize Committee was very careful to carve out the prize for Carrico and Weissman. It was for these COVID vaccines, not for the basic technology. So all of the jibber-jabber that they are credited with invention of the idea, that's all, frankly, bullshit. It's just more positioning and false narrative from corporate media that is being backed by, it's unclear, but there was a real aggressive campaign to get the Nobel for Carrico and Weissman, as often happens with Nobel Prizes. And I believe that the parties behind that were Pfizer, BioNTech, and University of Pennsylvania, where they had appointments.
Well, Dr. Malone, let me just jump in, because the brief narrative you just gave, unlike the New York Times article that comes up whenever someone Googles your name, it comes up at the very top. The narrative you just gave has the flavor of reality. I've worked on the edges of biomedical research. I've worked with some researchers on some clinical trials. I've worked with a startup. I've been in a skunk works.
Good. Okay, so you understand.
So what you say, just anyone who's been around it, the politics, the money, the prizes for the right person, because it just all has the flavor of reality. Unlike the articles that come up
at Vical was a guy named Phil Felgner, who's still in San Diego, and he's very aggressively tried to stake out credit for all this. But he is a lipid chemist. He had no background in immunology, no background in molecular biology, et cetera, but and by the way, Vical never carried the RNA forward. They couldn't make the RNA once I left. And so it all kind of fell apart, and they spent a couple $2 billion trying to develop DNA-based vaccines with Merck, but that ended up failing. So yeah, this is another story. The people that are graduate students and postdocs, when I was talking about this story historically and giving interviews, I got a lot of feedback from folks that, like you, have been at the front lines, and just gratitude that I was sharing the nature of the culture and what actually goes on. So, thanks for those comments.
The New York Times. I will say this, Dr. Malone: people would be surprised how many salesmen are involved.
Or salesmen, or propagandists, or it's all a continuum, right? Marketing, sales, propaganda. It's all kind of a continuum. The New York Times article that you're citing was written by a woman named Davy Alba. Right. Davy Alba, it turns out, is rather notorious for her, let's say, intelligence community connections. And she was funded to work at the New York Times at that point by the U.S. government. And this was her last article for the New York Times, and then she was terminated after that. She actually came to our house, and I've written about this to the farm. We hosted her. I'd gotten a recommendation from Cheryl Gay Stolberg at the New York Times, who recently wrote a really ugly attack article about Bobby Kennedy. But I had helped Cheryl Gay Stolberg earlier in her career with another, people aren't aware this isn't my first rodeo as a whistleblower. I shared quite a bit about what I knew concerning the Jesse Gelsinger death at UPenn under Jim Wilson. That kind of blew up the whole gene therapy field historically, particularly adenovirus vectors. So it was very disappointing. Alba came out. She wouldn't look at the patents. She wouldn't look at the primary documentation. It was clear she just wanted to do a hit. And, I regretted inviting her to the farm and being so open and transparent. That was the last time that I really had an unguarded interview with corporate media. These days, when I get pinged by corporate media, I'm extremely cautious. A whole bunch of them are just, the term that's used, the term of art is advocacy journalism. It's what's taught in J schools now. They no longer teach objective journalism. They teach advocacy journalism, which is really just another euphemism for propaganda. And by the way,
this is part of your this is part of your book, right? Psychological warfare. So this is news to me. I didn't realize that. It sounds like there were some Nobel Prize recipients that leveraged your work. Did I hear that correctly?
Absolutely. Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman. And Katie actually called me when I was at UC Davis as an assistant professor and asked for advice on the RNA world. I introduced her to some people, et cetera, et cetera. And she acknowledges that sort of these days. Early on, she was asserting, there was a New York Times interview, a CNN interview, in which she was asserting that this was all her idea. But then when I started objecting, and particularly my wife basically pulled out the old data and documentation and put together a summary piece with PDFs of all the things and sent that out. None of these journalists have ever looked at that, but it's available on the website. You can look at the primary information and make your own call about the cascade of events. And when that went out and I started speaking out, largely at my wife's insistence, then Katie Carrico kind of backed off, and the New York Times piece on her got edited. It's all, the Nobel Prize is so politicized.
Well, they gave it to Barack Obama before he even put his shoes on. So, right. That really blew up the credibility for me. And by the way, Dr. Malone, most people could not look at the documents and understand exactly what went on. And that's why the New York Times and the other mainstream media can successfully portray you as just a disgruntled former researcher who feels like he's been slighted, because most people don't understand. But time will tell, and the truth always comes out. So appreciate the background.
That's Doug. That's a favorable version of things. The other version is truth is always. History is written by the victors. So I'm not.
That's
holding
why
my
we have
breath.
to fight, right? That's why we're in a battle.
Yeah. Well, I have a great life. I have a great wife. 2 grandchildren are here right now. I live on a farm in Madison, Virginia, and I kind of. And the other day, I'm going to just disclose this for the first time in media. I just turned 65, and I bought myself a 65th birthday present. When I was a young man, my father had a 20-year-old Porsche 356A, and I just bought myself a 20-year-old 911. So I've
good for you.
Got beautiful horses, beautiful wife, grandkids. The whole quest for immortality and fame is really distorts people, and it's not my bag.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Malone, can I ask, because I went back in the archives when I heard that you were going to be on the show with my podcast, and I tried to find the article where I first encountered your name, and it was from June of 2021, and I tried to find it, and it's disappeared off the NOQ report. And as hard as I look, I can find no reference to I believe you were referencing a study, and I that was related to lipid nanoparticle accumulation in the ovaries, I think. And
yeah, so that was what you're referring to is probably the Dark Horse podcast with Brett Weinstein and Steve Kirsch. And that was the first big one. That had a couple of million views. Nothing like the Rogan podcast that I think might have gone to about 100. But the Weinstein one was, and Brett remains a good friend, as does Steve. What we're referring to there was the common technical document. Doug, you've had clinical research experience, so you understand what we used to call an initial new drug application is now a common technical document in Eurospeak. So this is the universal version of an IND application. And it was the one submitted by Pfizer to the Japanese technical authority, or their version of the FDA. And it was obtained by Byram, Dr. Byram Bridle of Canada, who has just been vilified. You think I've had it tough. Byram now has nervous tics. He still has his university appointment, but he's not allowed to go into his laboratory. He's lost his graduate students. I mean, it's just Canada's wicked. They're even harsher than what's gone on here in the States. And so Byram had obtained this. I don't know why the Japanese regulatory authority put it on their servers, but they did. And Byram managed to grab it, and he's a vaccine specialist academic. So he doesn't really know regulatory affairs so much, but he certainly understands immunology and vaccinology. And he read through this thing, he was stunned, and he made an evaluation and assessment. And he wanted to publish it, but the company that he submitted to at Trial Site News suggested that he should have a second opinion on this. And so it was sent to me. That's how it came in my hands. So we weren't able to get access to the Pfizer dossier that had been submitted, but this Japanese version, which actually was incomplete, now that we have the benefit of the retroscope, and the Pfizer papers, et cetera. But what was submitted to the Japanese was a subset of what was submitted to FDA CBER Peter Marks. So it was given to me to read as a second opinion. And I read through it. I agreed with all of Byram's conclusions. Apparently Byram, he's now a friend, was really intimidated by Dr. Malone providing a second analysis of his magnum opus here. And I was stunned by it. By the just overt failure to comply with both domestic U.S. and international norms in terms of regulatory submissions. And this is basically a piece of junk that was cobbled together from old data, and just, it's like whatever they could sweep off the floor, they put in the document and send it over to the FDA. And the FDA said, "Hey, well, it looks good to me. Let's go."
Wow.
And they pulled together all kinds of old junk. But it was very worrisome, and it demonstrated that these particles, remember the storyline at the time was that the particles, once injected into your deltoid, your shoulder, would go to the draining axillary lymph nodes, that's your armpit, and stay there and evoke an immune response. So it wouldn't go all over your body. But the data absolutely demonstrated that was false. And furthermore, I'm an expert in luciferase, frankly. That if you go back and look at that original PNAS paper, that was the first paper that used luciferase as a reporter gene to do statistical analyses of response. Before that, everybody used chloramphenicol transferase, which was a radioactive thin layer chromatography. I'm talking Doug talk here. It was a messy, hot, radioactive thing involving volatile chemicals. What could possibly go wrong, and did all the time. So S-35 contamination of benches at the Salk Institute was common. And luciferase transformed everything, but I was the first one to really use luciferase as a major reporter gene. And I was also a pioneer in using it in animals. And so when I saw the Pfizer data, I was stunned because they used the least sensitive methods for detecting the distribution of the reporter gene, luciferase, as RNA in these rodent models. They used whole body imaging, which is really insensitive. It's kind of a cool parlor trick. You can inject the gene or the RNA into an animal, and then you inject the substrate that the firefly uses called luciferin, and then you put it in a dark box with a photomultiplier tube, highly sensitive photomultiplier tube camera, and you count the original photons that are coming all the way through the animal to the camera, and that gives you an image, and basically you end up with glowing mice. Ooh, really cool. But if you really want to get accurate, you have to dissect the mice, take out the various tissues, grind them up, and then you can do a quantitative assessment of luciferase expression because it's linear over 4 logs. So I'm talking sciencey talk again.
And so, Dr. Malone, I hate to interrupt, but before we go further, you need to make clear that luciferase does not come from the devil, right?
Yeah, sorry. Luciferase and luciferin are names that were applied. It relates to light, not to the devil. And these are the enzymes which fireflies use and glowworms use to produce the little flashes of light. It's a kind of a miracle of biology that they're able to produce light from ATP, one of the key energy storage compounds that our cells use. And they do it through an enzymatic reaction, just like you can think of Pac-Man nibbling away at something. So luciferase is the enzyme that works on a chemical that the firefly produces called luciferin, requires ATP, and produces a photon of light, a little tiny flash of light. And that's how the firefly is able to basically control that reaction in his light organ. And that's how come you see the little flashes of light if you're where I live. I don't know where you guys live. It's a regional thing. But that's what luciferase and luciferin are. Nothing to do with the
Thank
devil.
you, because so many of my beloved and dear friends, as soon as they saw the term luciferase, they were certain that the shots were made by the devil, or they contained the mark of the beast or something like that. But in fact, luciferase is actually borrowed from God. Just wanted to make that clear. He gave it to the fireflies. We're just borrowing it for our purposes.
So instead of trying to produce the spike protein in the animals and look at where the spike protein was, which is what would normally be done and normally required for toxicology studies and biodistribution studies, instead they use this firefly protein and this sensitive assay, but then they use the least sensitive method, and they submitted this to the FDA. I actually scheduled and had a phone call with Peter Marks at the FDA. When I saw this, I assumed that Pfizer was pulling the wool over the eyes of the FDA, because this is kind of inside baseball. You have to understand these systems, having had worked with them, etc., like the problems with the DNA transfection. You'll recall that Peter Marks and a lot of the other anointed ones in the vaccine world all assert that you can't deliver DNA into cells that aren't dividing using this technology, when in fact this technology is specifically designed to deliver DNA into cells, and it's used all over the world at the graduate level for doing this. But somehow these guys, they missed that part of graduate school or something, or Peter Marks is an MD, and he had no training in cell biology and molecular virology or molecular biology, but he asserted this wasn't absolutely possible. What I'm referring to is the DNA contamination that is absolutely present in these current preparations that they're trying to jab all our children with. Byram Bridle gets the gold star for finding it. It got tossed to me. I agreed with everything Byram had identified and more, found more problems. And then I sent it to a more senior regulatory specialist that was a close colleague of mine I was working with, and asked him to look at it. And he said, yeah, Robert, everything that you identified is true, and it's a major error in this submission. And furthermore, there's these other things that you missed. And so I said, hey, well, why don't we write this up in Trial Site News? And he was like, no. you can write it up, but I don't want my name on it.
Oh, wow.
Well, so Dr. Malone, Real Science Radio, we spend a lot of time talking about, and you mentioned it earlier, this reverse engineering that you do, which I just think is incredible. So I want to get back to the whole psychological warfare, your book, Enforcing a New World Order. So you mentioned that part of this PsyWar is pushing a mindset that you have to follow the approved narrative. So I'd like to quickly play this clip from popular astrophysicist and socialist Neal deGrasse Tyson. So give this a watch.
So that when you are college educated and some institution has declared you graduated and a learned member of society, if you turn around and say, I choose not to believe this emergent scientific consensus, no, you don't have that option.
No,
Wow.
you don't have that option.
Yeah. Wow. Unbelievable. So, Dr. Malone, do we have an option?
Well, I sure hope so, because this is supposed to be science, not scientism.
Exactly.
Another one of the arguments that we make in the book is that scientism has become the new federal approved religion, that it has all the characteristics of a religion, a belief system, a religious belief system. And we, as those of us that have been in academia, often joke about the priesthood of the anointed science leaders that haven't necessarily done anything particularly important. Maybe in some cases they have, but once you're anointed as a high priest of science, then you're able to pontificate, just as you just heard. Of course, Tony Fauci would certainly be a high priest, if not an archbishop, in this hierarchy. And scientism absolutely has the characteristics of a religion that is endorsed by the state. It has become the new state-endorsed religion, as there has been this concerted effort to eliminate the role of the Judeo-Christian teaching, ethics, logic from the structure of our American politics and our body politic, our culture. There is, it's the war on religion is clear. It's well documented. There's lots of examples to support that. Let's call it a thesis or a hypothesis that there is a war on religion right now. And of course, this feeds into classic Marxist teaching. And now we're in an environment where, as so many have pointed out, economic Marxism has failed. It is no longer very potent or pervasive with young, open minds that are naive. And so they've switched to a form of cultural Marxism, of which wokeism is a component, but also scientism is a component of that. And in this scientism world, we have these individuals who have been endorsed by corporations, government, etc., as accepted speakers on behalf of this theology. and DeGrasse Tyson is one of them. Tony is another one. There are numerous that we've encountered in the vaccine world that are currently very active because of all the concerns about RFK Jr. Tipping over the apple cart and his appointment, nominal appointment as Director of Health and Human Services. So
Dr. Malone,
that's
I have to jump in on that. You just said RFK's nominal appointment, and so can you help me? I feel like I'm living in a very surreal moment when the forces of darkness that have dominated everything since the winter of 2020, the spring of 2020, they've dominated everything, taken everything they wanted, destroyed everyone they wanted to destroy, and suddenly they're not going to destroy RFK. They're not going to. I just feel like
the jury's
this is
still out on that one.
I feel like I'm living in a surreal moment where everything that people are expecting to happen, it just doesn't seem possible that the forces that have the power would allow it to happen. And it's just, I'm nervous about it. Tell me I'm just paranoid and help me not freak out.
You're not. So I have been closer at some points to the center of the storm with RFK Jr. and his campaign. And I'm still somewhat connected. And by way of conflict of interest disclosure, I have been asked to submit my CV and supporting documentation for some sort of position. I have no idea what. And that was about 3 weeks ago, and I haven't been contacted since. What has come out is a particularly important ex post from Del Bigtree, who is at the center of the vetting process for the HHS transition team with Bobby. And Del put out a curiously worded comment and has communicated independently with me via text since then. And I don't want to quote him, but basically the position is being taken that they don't want to hire people who have been. It's quite clear they don't want to appoint below Bobby people who have been labeled as anti-vaxxers by the media. That's now a disqualification.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
And so they what they are seeking to hire, and you can see it in the appointments, are people that are considered to be more mainstream. So you have Jay Bhattacharya, who is a very cautious individual, a lovely person. I like him very much. As director of NIH, he has no experience in large government contracts. He has no experience in the government, no experience with NIH, but he's going to become the new director. Basically because the thesis is that his contributions with the Great Barrington Declaration and the censorship he experienced. And then you have the new director of the FDA, who is a Johns Hopkins academic who is supportive of the jabs but against the mandates. And a number of other appointments. Surgeon General was appointed basically as a quid pro quo to a senator. I wrote a Substack about this the other day, essentially saying many are disappointed. Welcome to DC politics. Trump is still very much of the mindset that Operation Warp Speed was a great success, that the vaccine was a great success. He's not backing down on that. And I knew that to be the case because I have other friends that are very close to him that were in the other administration. And I still kind of, I endorsed him before Bobby did because of other things, but knowing that I was going to take flack because of his vaccine position. But considering the options, I thought this was the absolute best thing. And if he hadn't been elected, then we would be in a much deeper problem. I'm really encouraged that he will act against the World Health Organization again, that he is a opponent of globalism, a supporter of American nationalism. A lot of the things that he has taken as policy positions are very much aligned with where I'm at, but don't expect, if there's any radical change that's going to happen in HHS, in my opinion, it's going to come from Ramaswamy and Musk and the Doge initiative.
Okay.
Not
So this Dr. J. Bhattacharya, you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration. And just to quote their website, they had grave concerns about the damaging physical and mental health impacts of prevailing COVID-19 policies and recommend an approach we call focused protection. I'm curious, did you sign that? They had quite a few signatures from
No, I was not a
scientists.
signatory to the Great Barrington, but Peter Navarro and I put out op-eds in the Washington Times that were aligned with many of those positions, which seems to have been what provoked the Atlantic Monthly attack piece, by the way.
Okay, and so Dr. Malone, is the Great Barrington Declaration the reason you called Jay Bhattacharya a very cautious person? I found the Great Barrington Declaration to be erring too much on the side of caution, frankly, in my opinion.
I know Jay quite well. He's a friend. I just saw him a couple weeks ago. I'll see him in about a week and a half in the context of the Brownstone Institute. By the way, it was Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone who was the real person behind Great Barrington. He was the one that called the meeting, convened the meeting. He took the flack about that also, but he's not somebody who seeks attention. Shout out to Brownstone Institute. If your viewers and readers are not familiar with that, it's an amazing nonprofit, kind of a hybrid think tank and media, alternative media source. And they have donations. They have some fellows that are modestly supported, but it's not like the Heritage. They've got oodles of money.
Brownstone's good.
So Jeffrey Tucker was the one really behind it. So I like Jay a lot, but Jay is a very cautious academic. Come on, he's survived Stanford University and heads up his own Department of Health Policy. He's a full professor. He is a centrist, cautious academic from one of the top academic institutions in the world.
So who is this Atlantic hit piece against? I didn't catch that earlier. Was that against you or against?
Yeah. No, it's against me. It's notorious. They have a rough image of me with, it looks like a skull and crossbones, two syringes crossed in front of my face. And this is the one that was written by the young man who mostly writes for the the Chronicle of Higher Education, in basically pro-woke articles. But he was hired and paid for by Chan Zuckerberg, hired by remember the Atlantic Monthly is owned by Steve Jobs' widow, who has close ties to, what's her name, the Epstein. She's in jail right now. So Atlantic is propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've never, I don't believe we've ever quoted the Atlantic here on Real Science Radio. And while we never officially endorsed any candidate for president, we are happy that the communists lost. And the fact that you just said Del Bigtree is involved in vetting, that's what makes this so surreal to me, Dr. Malone. People whose names were officially verboten, destroyed, discredited, they're now involved in the transition to... I don't know. It's hard for me to believe.
Well, the bizarre thing is Del, who made his fame and fortune. I mean, he has a huge spread. He's got a dedicated cook for his team, huge studio, dwarfs mine by about tenfold. And tons of donations because of the Vaxxed movie in part. So he has a wealthy, rather substantial donor base, and is a bona fide and proud of it anti-vaxxer, and had been Bobby's head of media during Bobby's campaign, and is the one now taking the position that they have to be moderate in their appointments. My inference in the essay that I put out on Substack was that, at first Trump had wanted Bobby to be a czar, which would not be a Senate confirmed position, responsible for rooting out corruption in USDA, CDC, FDA, and NIH. And I thought that was I gave multiple interviews that was what all the smoke signals were indicating. And then, but I knew privately that Bobby really wanted director of of HHS. I had counseled that that was biting off more than he probably really wanted to chew. HHS is, I think, second only to DOD in terms of budget size, maybe even larger. It's a massive, massive organization that is far beyond the things that Bobby usually talks about. So hence they got Dr. Oz, media celebrity, to run the Center for Medicaid Services, CMS. Dr. Oz that lost his PA race against Federstein. So that's how that's played out. And I think what happened was that the media storm, I'm choosing my words, I could use rougher language, that broke after this naming of Bobby to HHS was so fierce. I think that it basically, my inference is it caused the transition team to, it intimidated them and caused them to choose a strategy that would be more acceptable, basically, if you think about it, to pharma. And so that's where we're at. Is they're selecting people that are less controversial. The Surgeon General was endorsed by Peter Hotez.
Yeah, anyway, so politics doesn't change on a dime, and you can't turn a ship. And so I understand all that, but it's rather disheartening that the size of the mandate that's been handed to the president-elect is probably the biggest mandate since 1984, bigger than 1984, and so it would be nice if he could maximize the change that he's able to make.
You got to understand that he is still all in.
Oh, yes.
On the success of the jabs and Operation Warp Speed. He considers that to be one of his major achievements. And
yes.
So you just got to kind of compartmentalize that off. And the odd thing is that he has basically said, okay, I'm going to take this New Deal Democrat, which is what Bobby is. When he talks about Kennedy Democrats, what he's referring to is people who are still in the political metaphor pre-Carter, pre-Jimmy Carter. And that's Bobby's political belief system. That's what caused me when I went to his rally in Boston for the original kickoff, and I realized that was the case. It resulted in Jill and I distancing ourselves from the campaign and electing not to endorse Bobby despite requests to do so. So
wow.
He is in between us and your viewership. My crystal ball says this is not a marriage made in heaven, and it may not be sustainable.
Yeah, that's been my suspicion. Now, Dr. Malone, now that Donald Trump has been elected, is your book now obsolete? Is the PsyWar over? And we can all breathe a sigh of relief. A sigh of relief. Did I say that?
I wish that was the case.
Things are heating up, but we're going to have to hit pause and ask you to tune in next week for the rest of our interview with the renowned Dr. Robert Malone. He's going to get into more details in his latest book, PsyWar, Enforcing the New World Order. There's enormous psychological warfare going on right now. It's affecting all of us. So you're going to want to tune in for the rest of this show. It's been an exciting time with Dr. Robert Malone. We also ask you to please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Please leave comments on our videos. All these things help the YouTube algorithm to put our show in front of more people across the YouTube universe. See you next week.